So this is Lana Zhang and partner Brian Shapiro, and today we are interviewing Rogene Gee Calvert. So let's get started. Tell me about your family. Your mom and dad came to Houston, right?
Yes.
So tell me about your childhood. What was it like?
Okay. Well, I'll start with when my mom and dad came and how they came. My father came from China. He was a teenager. Well, he was actually not a teenager when he first came. He had to be probably, I think it was like, well, he was probably 17. That's the best I can put together. And he came through Angel Island, which, as you may know, was a detention camp outside of San Francisco in San Francisco Bay. And he came as a teenager and as a paper son, and I think you may know what that term means. He had false passport. So he came as a Hom. His surname was Hom. And the passport said he was actually 4 years younger than what he really was. So his passport said I think he was supposed to be 13. And so he was actually 17 or around just about, but you know, puberty. So if he was 16, 17, whatever, he sure didn't probably look like he was 14.
Right.
So that was already, or whatever the age was, that was already a problem. I found out after my father passed away in 1984 from who I call my uncle, but not really his brother, but it was like it was a blood relative from the same village, but they came over at the same time. And Uncle Harry told me afterwards that Dad stayed in Angel Island for almost a year, which is a long time. I mean, they did keep some people there a while, but almost a year was a long time. And so, I mean, you know, looking back, I'm very grateful that he was eventually allowed to move on, even though it was, you know, illegal. But at that time, that was about the only way you could come to this country. As you know, we were under the Chinese Exclusion Act, and so unless you were a merchant or a student or somebody of means, you know, you weren't able to come here. So he then went to California, San Francisco, and I think he stayed in Stockton and lived there for a few years. As a young man, probably in his then maybe 20s, he came to Houston, and that's kind of where this book picks up, because we researched why did so many G's come to Houston, and we traced it back to really 3 elders that came from that part of China, that province or that village, and 2 of them were brothers, the Chu brothers, and one was Harry Gee, who you may know of and who is a Rice alum. Harry's father. The 3 elders came to Houston for various reasons, and Harry's father started sort of, I think he was in the grocery business, but he eventually went into the restaurant business, so he kind of went off in the restaurants. The Chu brothers started in the grocery store business, and they helped young men like my father, who at that time was single, in his probably early 20s, you know, had learned English obviously when he got here, having lived in San Francisco, California area for a while, but they learned the grocery store trade. So there was probably a half a dozen of them, like my dad, single, came over here because of the Chu brothers, learned a trade, learned a business. They actually bought 5 grocery stores in Houston and helped them each set up in these stores. So then my dad, I think, was about 31, if I'm not mistaken, and he was matched in marriage to my mother, who was born in San Francisco, Chinatown. And her father knew my father's aunt, who put them together. They were matched, and they met and got to know each other for about a week, I hear. And he then brought her from beautiful San Francisco to Houston, Texas in 1941. And so, and back then, Houston was a lot different, and they had 4 children. I'm the second of 4, 3 boys and a girl, and we were all born in Houston. So I grew up in what's known as Third Ward right now. That's what it's known as now. It's near TSU's new U of H area. It's called Third Ward. And that's where I grew up. We had lived in another house, but when I was born, we had moved into this house that we rented. No, actually, we owned it. And it was across the street from another Chinese family who we were not related at all. And they are from like Hawaii and Oklahoma, and they settled in Houston for a long time. And they had 3 daughters. All 3 went to Rice, by the way. They were some of the first Chinese or Asians that ever came to Rice when it was Rice Institute. They're about 10 to 15 years older than me. But the 2 families lived across the street from each other for 20-something years. And my mother cooked dinner for them. It was the parents and the 3 daughters. They ran a little grocery store, a neighborhood grocery store, and we lived across the street. My dad worked and owned another grocery store, and he worked, in another place. So I grew up in the grocery store business, but I grew up in their grocery store because it was easy for me to go across the street. And so that was my first job. About 12 years old, they put me to work, and I got, paid a weekly little salary, and started to learn how to, work the grocery business. My mom would cook dinner for all of us, both families, every night for, like I said, I'd say 18 years or so. And we ate together every night. My dad wouldn't eat with us. He'd eat at the store and then came home because the grocery store business had very long hours. Mm-hmm. And they would close up and then, clean up, count money, whatever they would do. And then they'd get home. It'd be 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. So we always ate together, and then we would come home. And like I said, this from the time I could start remembering, which was about 4 or 5 years old, and until I graduated from high school, we did that. And actually, when I started college, we moved, and that neighborhood we lived in, though, had been largely Jewish. I don't know how familiar you are, but it's a very that corner we lived on, or that area we lived in with the grocery store, across the street was an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. So when I grew up around Orthodox Jewish rabbis with the long beards and the heavy coats and all. And the neighborhood had been a lot of Jewish people lived there. And then, of course, they moved out, and the whites moved out, and the blacks moved in. So it was mostly a black neighborhood when I was growing up. So our customer base was African American black. And it was, doing a lot of neighborhood business. That synagogue is now a community center, Shape Community Center, which is a real prominent black community center. And so it's nice to, kind of see all that history forming over the decades. The Seatolls, which is what their name is, C''Tol, they continued living there and operated the business there for 50 years. We moved out, like I said, when I started college, but we've always been stayed friends and all, and, their grandchildren now are grown, and it's just really remarkable. But we moved to what's known as Hiram Clark area, which is off of Main Street in Hiram Clark. And we only lived there for just a few years. I was in college most of that time we moved there. But somebody wanted to buy our house, and so then we moved in the Bracewood area. So it was interesting. We lived in one house for like 18-something years, 20 years, and then all of a sudden we moved twice within, I'd say within 4 or 5 years. So my dad passed away. Eventually they owned another store right on Holman Street, right near U of H, and they ran it. My mom joined him in the grocery business. My younger brothers helped them in the store, and so eventually they ran it. And then my dad passed away in 1984, and about a year later my mom and brothers sold the store. So we got out of the business, and at that time, and even before my dad passed away, things were getting a little bit scary. It wasn't really safe. A lot of it was hard to run a little business. So it was good to get out of it. I, at that time, had gone on to college, and I went to UT in Austin, and then I got married right after that. So I was really away from home for a good, probably 5 years. My brothers, 2 younger brothers, went to school at U of H and stayed here. One of them, the older of the 2, went to St. Thomas, and then the younger one went to U of H. But the older of the 2 eventually moved to New York, where he's lived for 30 years now. My younger brother still lives here, and he's raised his family actually in Fort Bend and Sugarland, in in Meadows. My oldest brother had gone to Texas Tech, and he's 6 years older. He graduated and came back to Houston and has lived and worked here ever since. So he has worked for Merrill Lynch for 30-something years, and he has a daughter. So 2 brothers still here, 1 in New York. And I ended up, after getting married, my husband was in the Air Force after we got married. We both graduated from UT, and it was during the Vietnam era. So he was sent to Thailand, and I came back home to live since I couldn't go with him. And when he got discharged, he came back here, and we never left, which is a surprise because we had not planned to stay here. He was not really crazy about a big city. He's from San Antonio, but ended up staying here, and we raised our 2 kids, and now 1 is married, and they're both here. So it's 3 generations that have been here. Yeah,
that's amazing. You said growing up that your neighborhood was predominantly black, but there was 1 Asian family across the street from you. So did you feel that you were discriminated against?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I have to honestly say I've rarely felt discriminated against, and mainly maybe because I have grown up in the mainstream population. Because when I was growing up, the neighborhood was predominantly black and some Jewish, and the elementary that I went to, which was sort of the neighborhood elementary, were a lot of Jewish and white, and it was still segregation of schools. Mm-hmm. So blacks were not allowed to come to our school. And being Asian, there's always the story, I'm sure many Asians growing up in the South have said that, what am I? Because in some instances you were considered, white, and in many instances you were not considered white, you were considered colored. And in the South, you've heard about the 2, water fountains and restrooms for colored and for whites. So where do we go? So those were dilemmas. But when I was growing up, desegregation was starting. The last year of my high school year, so I graduated in 1966 from San Jacinto, which is a high school you probably have never heard of because it used to be HCC. It started off at San Jacinto High School and down on Holman Street, where Houston Community College is now. And I was probably the 3rd to the last graduating class, before they closed it and made it a vocational school. Mm-hmm. But in the last year of my high school year, I think they had started the segregation, either last year or 2 years. So before that, though, there were no blacks in my school. So I went to school and really felt very comfortable among whites because there were very few Asians, mm-hmm. Mainly Chinese from the south, south part of China, from Canton, known as Canton then. And we all kind of had the same background. Our dads had, and moms had come from China. My mom was unique in that she was born in the United States, but she was very traditional, coming from Chinatown, mm-hmm. San Francisco Chinatown. So she really kept a lot of traditions and all. But compared to other women that came from China who couldn't really speak English well, didn't drive, didn't know a lot of stuff, she kind of led the way. Even though she only had maybe a 9th grade education, she knew a lot more and was able to navigate, a lot more. So she helped a lot of her friends make doctor's appointments or talk to people who they needed to talk to or find out about stuff. She did that a lot, and they were always grateful for that help they got from her. But anyway, so I just always felt comfortable being very one of the few Chinese around, because in our school we had maybe not even a dozen, maybe on one hand you could count the Chinese in our school growing up, and we all knew each other, of course. We got together at church on Sundays because the Chinese Baptist Church you probably heard about, it's on Brogdon in the Spring Branch Memorial area now, but it used to be where George R. Brown Convention Center is. It was downtown. So we would all congregate socially at church as a teenager growing up. We had social clubs like the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, CACA Youth Club would hold dances, that we'd go to, or there'd be parties at people's homes. But most of us grew up working in the grocery store business, and when that meant on Saturday nights you'd close the store at 8:30, 8 o'clock, clean up. You'd get out of the store maybe 9ish, 10ish, and that's when you'd go out and party because you were tied up before that. So our parties got started late. We didn't know anything like curfews because we would stay out as long as we could, and then we'd get a ride home, and that was that. So I think back, and it just wasn't an overt thing to me, but there was always mimicking, and how kids are, they'd make fun of you. So there was a lot of that, especially in the black neighborhood. Kids would make fun of us, and so especially when we were young. But those are things you kind of get over to a certain extent. The bullying that you hear about now, we didn't suffer through that. But I think that because there weren't many Chinese or Asians around when I grew up, we really did feel more comfortable amongst the mainstream groups. And the other thing, so we always had a childhood dream, at least I did. I think the rest of my family did. So because my mother was from San Francisco, and we always, would know that our relatives, she had 3 brothers and 2 sisters there, so we had cousins and all. And we didn't do a lot of traveling back then. This was in the 40s, 50s. So it wasn't like you jumped on a plane and went anywhere. I think my first trip, I'd gone to San Francisco as a little child. I remember we drove there in the car, but on my own, it was like on a Greyhound bus. So I'd done it, and met a girlfriend and I went together. It was like our, dream trip on a Greyhound bus all the way to San Francisco. It was miserable. But anyway, so our dream was that we were going to go back to San Francisco one day because, here in Houston, there weren't too many that looked like you, and you were different. And so it was kind of growing up when you're young, you didn't want to be different. You wanted to be like everyone else. So we always sort of longed to go to San Francisco, to live there and be there because, when we did visit there, it was like you saw hundreds of people that looked like you. And Chinatown was such a great place. You could never get all of those, foods and ingredients and things that, now it's like terrific. But back then, my mom would either improvise, or we had, 1 or 2 import-export stores, but they were small, and they would get stuff imported from China or wherever. Back then, you didn't have the trade that we have now either, because China wasn't open to us. So it was stuff that was, from San Francisco, obviously. Well, my grandfather owned an import-export store in Chinatown. It was very well known on Grant Avenue in Chinatown. So when we'd go visit, or if somebody went there or somebody came to visit us, they would bring tons of stuff. They would pack their suitcases with all this stuff, smelly stuff, herbs and dried stuff and all the things that you take it for granted now when you go to Chinatown here and you go buy stuff. We'd have to import it in, and I remember we would bring, so now you can go to any restaurant and order dim sum and, eat the little, pastries. Well, back then, if you wanted to eat them, you had to make them from scratch. And when we went to San Francisco, or if they came to Houston, we would pack suitcases full of those little dim sum things. I mean, you'd think they'd spoil, but we brought them here, and it was just a treat. It was just wonderful. And I remember that after Houston started becoming more international, we had all of these places to buy all this stuff and everything. And my relatives would still come visit. This would be in the 80s and 90s and stuff. They'd still bring stuff. And we'd say, no, you don't need to do this anymore. We can go buy all this. But it was interesting how back then you really had to, it was so different. So now when I see Houston, growing up here and seeing that we had nothing, and what we have now is just tremendous.
When do you think was the turning point for Houston to become kind of an urban metropolitan?
Well, I would say in the 90s, but it really started turning in the 80s. So when I grew up, Chinatown is the old downtown Chinatown, okay? There are remnants of it you probably have seen. I mean, but that was and even what you see now, some of those buildings weren't there when I was growing up. So we'd have one block of, a merchants association, which is where some of the men went and gambled, and it was like closed off, and of course gambling wasn't allowed, but they would be in there playing mahjong and gambling. And we'd have a couple of dances there because it was like a big hall. Then down below was a restaurant. Well, nothing like the Chinese restaurants, but it was the closest thing we had for a Chinese restaurant. And so after church, we'd walk downtown, which was like 2 blocks away, and go to a movie, because we had 3 theaters in the downtown area, the Metropolitan, the Majestic, and the Lowe's theaters. And then we'd walk to have something to eat at what was it called? It just slipped my mind, the restaurant. And then we would go to Woolworths or Five and Dime store. That actually we couldn't do that because on Sundays they didn't allow stores to be open, so we couldn't have done that. I forget when we'd go to those stores, but they were downtown. Anyway, then we'd walk back to church and have evening service. So that was sort of how we spent our weekend. So in the 80s, some of those businesses started to move out to Southwest, and people started to move out there, and more people started to live out there, and that's why that became more of a thriving business sector and downtown started to sort of die out because people could just shop there, they lived there, it was easier, and land was cheap. That's why they were moving. But the 90s and then the 80s we saw, okay, so in the 60s when the Chinese Exclusion Act and it was the whole immigration thing opened up, and I know you've learned about that, and they expanded the quotas for people to come here. And so more Chinese started coming from, Taiwan and Hong Kong because of educational opportunities. Then in the late 70s and 80s, with the Vietnam War, more Vietnamese came. So of course you had 2, 3, 4 waves of Vietnamese, Southeast Asians that came because they were refugees. And so we started to see the Asian population really growing. So the Vietnamese started buying the property in Midtown, and we had called that Little Saigon, because actually the Vietnamese, because they bought that area, put businesses there, nothing like you see now. I mean, there was a lot more there than you see now. There are some things still there now, but before it was even more, and they lived there too. So that became like Little Saigon, and then we had the old Chinatown areas. But then as the land was cheap and everything, and the businesses moved out there, it was just, people started moving out there. Now, that's the Sharpstown area, and people don't remember this, but when Asians started to buy property and homes out there, it was not a happy scene. There was a lot of problems with, they're moving in and lowering our property. So there was a lot of hatred and problems then. And then we were able to get the street signs put in Chinese. Well, that hasn't been done anywhere. Well, in Midtown it was done, but they tried to do it in Spring Branch with Korean, and the community wouldn't allow it. So a lot of this was done early on before anyone really caught on. And but in Sharpstown there was a lot of contention because the whites that were there, and Sharpstown was considered a really nice area when it was first established, and also didn't like the Asians, the Chinese, and then the Vietnamese coming. So if you look at the evolution of Southwest Asia Town or Chinatown, from I'd say about Fondren or Gessner, you go west, it's mainly Chinese. That's because that's who moved there first, and that was the new Chinatown. Then, of course, as you keep going west and past the Beltway, you see more Vietnamese, because that's when they started to come and buying property, and so they moved further west. And now, it goes all the way to Highway 6, and it's just really huge. So I, really look back and see that whole transition happening. And so in 2000 is really when the economic boom is when you really saw all the businesses started to build up. And in the mid-2000s, you really saw a lot of these shopping centers, develop. And so now foreign investors have come in and bought a lot of the property. And that's what caused a lot of the development to happen.
I wanted to ask you about your professional life, and I saw that you've been involved in many nonprofit organizations and advocacy and public policy. What made you go into that?
Was all an accident. No. Well, it was half accident and half design. I am a political science major in school, so obviously political stuff, it interests me. But I never really got involved in. I was sort of on the periphery, but not really in, really in the heart of it for a while. But I always enjoyed it. I got into nonprofit work by accident. When I was at UT, the School of Social Work was a shack. And that always, to me, that's what social work was about, was this really austere little shacky thing, whereas all these other colleges had these nice buildings and all. So when I came back home, when my husband was in the Air Force in Thailand and I came home to live, I was looking for a job. And with a political science degree, nothing's changed. It was not easy to find a job back then either. And so I got a job with it was a drug evaluation project. So back then, there was a lot of federal dollars available for projects and programs. And so drug abuse and drug, methadone clinics and different methods of addressing drug problems, drug abuse. That was sort of a prevalent thing because it was the 70s. It would be the early 70s. So it was after the 60s, which was a big drug haven then. But so I got a job. It was really, I went into Baylor College of Medicine to look at what jobs were available, and this popped up. I interviewed. The guy was really nice, so I started working with him. And it turned out that this was a federally funded project to evaluate different drug abuse methodologies to to solve drug abuse, to treat drug abuse is what I'm trying to say. So it was really interesting, and I can't believe I did it. I mean, we'd go to homes to interview these supposedly drug addicts to see, how they liked their treatment and all. Crazy. But that project ran out of money, and so then I went to the next project, as you do with federal projects, is you still stay on this grant as long as you can until the next grant comes up. Well, the organization that was sort of housing this agency, the agency was called the Community Welfare Planning Association. And back then, social planning was really important because it was right after President Johnson started put a lot of money into model cities and a lot of federal programs. So social planning, that's when daycare was starting and drug, treatment and all of these things. So CWPA was funded by the United Way. Back then it was called the United Fund. And we actually were located in the same building downtown. But there was a national kind of effort they were questioning the value of these planning associations because they were very progressive, whereas United Way was more conservative because they, really had to depend on corporate money as they continue to do. And so you had this rub of conservative and progressive, and back then, a lot of social programming and everything. So across the country, a lot of these planning associations were being defunded by the United Way. Well, in Houston, ours was a very strong organization, and we had some strong people on our board. Well, instead of defunding, they actually merged some of the functions we did in this planning association into the United Way. Some of the things they felt were very important to the community, such as information and referral, the telephone line that you call for help, research, planning, evaluation. And so I, being on this side of the table, thought, I'm not going to be part of that organization. I ended up staying at the United Way for 11 years because it was, we were able to do a lot of good things, and a lot of the things we did in the CWPA, we moved over there, and so I was involved with it. Actually, this shows you how old I am. So I was involved in computerizing the first directory that was put out, and this is when we were using key punch cards. So I would handle a box of key punch cards, this big, and these little cards. And it was crazy. I know. It's just to know to see what we have now. And so I adapted a printed book into these key punch cards, and then it ran on computer, which enabled us to update a lot faster. Now, it's still very cumbersome compared to now, but it was not like you had to go by hand to, do everything. And so that was my claim to fame, was I got to do the first really computerized directory. So I left the United Way in 1986, and I became the head of a child abuse prevention organization. So it's the first time I've headed up my own organization. It was great because it was like running your own business. You do everything. You're a one-person shop, and you just learned everything. So it's a great learning experience. And so that's how I continued in the nonprofit business. I learned a lot at United Way, especially the administrative arm. So, going back to my idea of what social work was from UT. So I thought it was mainly clinical. That's what I thought. Well, social work, there's advocacy, there's planning, there's research, there's all aspects. And so that's kind of what I learned in the process when I worked for the Community Welfare Planning Association. I was involved in an aging project, the drug project or evaluation, and a lot of other things. And so after the child abuse program that I headed up, we went through a merger, and that was an interesting thing. I worked there for 6 years, and my children were then school age, and I decided to take a little time off to, be at home with them. And at that time, my friend, Martha Wong, decided to run for city council. So that was in 1993. So I stayed at the Child Abuse Prevention Council or Network for 6 years. So it was 1993. and she asked if I'd like to volunteer on her campaign. She decided to run for city council. And at that time, she was the first Asian that had really jumped into a political campaign. We may have had one or two over the years before, but they probably tried it. I mean, it wasn't like a big splash, but Martha was, very well known. She'd been very active in the mainstream community, the Asian community, educational area. She just had a big following, a great candidate. And so I ended up being her campaign manager, or I handled the volunteers in the office. And Alice Lee, who I think you've also, she's in the, has been interviewed. Alice was her scheduler. So the two of us, Alice took time, actually, a hiatus from her job. I didn't have a job, so it worked out for me. But I learned a lot about campaigns and running for office and stuff. So Martha was the very last candidate to get to file, or she waited till the last day to file. So in that race, which was District C, which is this area, there were I think 9 or 11 people that filed. So it was a huge number. And the leader had been in the race for a while. He had declared early. He had gone and gotten a lot of money, a lot of endorsements and everything. And so she was the last to get in and had a big catch-up to do. Well, it was like a storybook campaign. We worked very hard. We had a great consultant, and it was just really great. And we got lots of people involved, volunteers. The Asian community had never done this before, so they were real eager. And like I said, she's a great candidate. And so she made the runoff. So the top 2 made the runoff, and then she won the race, and it was just wonderful because nobody paid attention to you when you're far back and they don't think you have a chance. But then she made the runoff, so she got a few more, a little bit more support. But the guy that was favored, he also made the runoff, so everyone thought he would win. But then she won. So, but Alice ended up working with Martha in City Hall. I didn't go to City Hall, and I started to that was about the time I got really involved in the community. I had always done volunteer work with, mainstream, especially being at United Way. I knew a lot of the nonprofit organizations and services and all, so I knew a lot about that. But what I was starting to see is our community in Houston was growing. As I said, the Southeast Asians were coming because of the Vietnam War. Chinese were coming from Taiwan, Hong Kong. China had opened up. We were seeing a lot of immigration. And I would travel, to different cities with smaller numbers of Asians than we had here. And they had community centers, health centers, mental health centers for Asians and everything. And I thought, why don't we have anything like that? So I started to help start some of these organizations or some of the programs that I felt we needed in the community, because language was an issue, cultural issues, were barriers. And so in 1993, 96, in that period, we really started up several programs. 2 that I'm especially proud of. One is the Asian American Family Services, which is, we called it Asian American Counseling Center, Family Counseling Center when we started it. But we started that up, and it was mainly mental health. And then the Asian American Health Coalition was devoted to physical health. And we knew that we one day wanted to start a clinic. But, we couldn't start at day one. So we did education and advocacy. All of us had full-time jobs, did other things. But this was really important to us. So we did this we started it in about 94. Both organizations started about the same time. And I worked with different groups of people to start them. And to this day, they both are very, very large and successful organizations. They have over $1 million budgets, and just, really proud of them. So I also started a couple of other projects, couple were not Asian. They were more related to children's services, which was something very important to me also at the time, or period, I shouldn't say at the time, but it's important to me. And then the other health areas was a diabetes awareness project we started for Asian Americans, which has folded into the clinic now. But it was a great time for me because I had the flexibility to do this. Then I did contract work, and on some of the projects I would work, as a staff person, but oftentimes I was a volunteer on the board or on the steering committee to help get it started. So that's how I kind of got started with the Asian organizations that I did, because there was such a need in our community, and seeing it, grow from really nothing to, everything. We really needed these resources.
Mm-hmm. So you've received many awards and recognition. How do you feel being a model to the Asian American community?
Well, you don't think of yourself as that, Of course, you're very grateful. I am, of being recognized. It shows that somebody is, does care and does want to reward you for the hard work, because it is hard work. And I always say to people who want to do something like start up a program or start up a business or anything, it just takes persistence. It takes a good 5 years of just keeping at it. And, if you give up, then you have to start all over, because it's just a gradual thing. No, it's always nice to be recognized, especially by your peers and those that know what it takes to do that. So I'm very grateful.
Can I ask a few questions about your personal life and your family life now?
Sure.
Okay, so how long have you been married?
So this December, it'll be 41 years.
Congratulations.
42 years, 42. Excuse me. We got married in 1970, so it makes it easy to do the math. 42 years. Yeah.
Is your husband Asian or?
No, he isn't. He isn't Asian. He's Anglo, WASP, as they say. Like I said, we met in college, mm-hmm. and it was something, again, that I wasn't quite expecting, being brought up in a very traditional Asian Chinese family. You're kind of taught to marry within your race, and that's something that your parents want you to do, and you try to obey your parents. That's what you try to do. But for various reasons and life lessons, we made the decision to get married, or I made the decision to marry him, and it took a little time to heal and all that, but it was very, very good. I mean, both my parents have passed away now, but it was, after we got married and they got to know him, and he had a chance to help them out. So the grocery store I referred to that they took over from a family that sold it to them, but it was the first store that we owned outright. My father was in partnership before, so it's the first store we owned outright, and my family actually worked in it together. Because, like I said, when I grew up, I worked for someone else and all of that. But he helped remodel the grocery store for my parents to enable them to sell wine and beer. These little mom and pop stores, their margin of profit is very low, and things like beer and wine are real important. Cigarettes, the sin tax and all of those things. I mean, unfortunately, but for them, they have to sell these products in order to make some profit. Well, when they took over that store, a church had been built within the regulation yards that the city required for you to get the license to sell beer and wine. And so it lapsed when they bought this store, so they couldn't get it renewed. Mm-hmm. So for probably, I'd say a good 6-7 years, they were unable to, get a license to sell because of the square footage. I mean, because their entrance was too close to the church. So Ken's an architect, and when he got out of the Air Force and came back home and all, he enrolled at U of H and went to architecture school there. He ended up getting not an architectural degree at UT. He got also a political science degree. But he decided to go back to school and get an architectural degree at U of H and a master's as well. So while he was in school, he helped them remodel the grocery store and was able to change the entrance to be the regulated amount of yardage to meet the requirement so they could then qualify. So not only did that happen, but he kind of, spruced it up a lot and made it nicer and little parking spaces, and so it helped. And so they were eternally grateful for that. But it was good. And so now, like I said, we have 2 kids, and we've lived here for 40-something years or close to that.
Tell me about your kids now. What are they doing?
Well, Evan, our oldest, is my son. Our son is 30, and he graduated. They both graduate from Trinity. They both went to school here in Houston, public school, and then went to Trinity University. And so Evan graduated, and then he got a job in banking, and he worked for Amnesty Bank for a few years, and then just recently changed industries, decided to really change his sort of career, I guess, and got into energy. And he works for Canton, which is a energy brokerage firm, and he is a real-time dispatcher. So he's watching the grid, and Canton doesn't do any energy power stuff here in Texas or in this area of the country. It's all northeast. So he's watching, Connecticut, New York, whatever states they do, and that's what he has to do, and decides, when to switch off and on and change things. So he's learning a lot, and it's really different, and he's enjoying it. So he's married, and his wife is a physician's assistant at Methodist ER, so they have a very busy life. No grandkids yet. Grandpets, a lot of grandpets. Our daughter is Lindsay. She's 27, soon to be 28, and she kind of started off in the nonprofit like myself, but she's in international education. She oversees the largest scholarship program for low-income students called the Gilman Scholarship Fund. And it gives scholarships to low-income students to travel abroad, to study abroad. And it's also here in Houston, located at the Institute for International Education. And she's done very well there. She's worked there over 5 years and has been promoted to assistant director now.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm real proud of both of them.
When you were raising your kids, did you try to instill them with their Chinese heritage, or did you take a more, American approach?
Well, it's very interesting because I kind of look at our situation because I have very good friends who are Chinese and who have interracially married as well and have interracial children, and I kind of see sort of what they've gone through and some of the issues. To my knowledge, I think my kids have been very comfortable growing up biracial, and they have tended to probably be more in the, I guess, mainstream American culture. But surprisingly to me, and very happily, they keep a lot of their Chinese roots too. And I think a lot of that has to do with being raised with my family here, because of course I said my mom was here a long time after my dad passed away. She lived as a widow for 30 years, and then my brothers and then cousins and things. And so and because I got active in the Asian community back, again in the 80s and 90s, I think they also, some of that rubbed off. So they adhere a lot to a lot of traditions. I mean, we're not real traditional, but as traditional as we can be being brought up here in my, again, in my household. But those things are important to them. And so one thing that's happened, example, is my son, who is, like I said, 30. And, when you're 30, you're usually making your own life and whatever social life you enjoy at that time. And they're married, so, they have their friends and all. But the Gee family. So he is now president of the Gee Family Association, which is really something because I don't think I twisted his arm. But he felt that it was important to get involved in, first of all, community, and that would be something. So he has given good leadership. And for a young person to get involved in a family association is not real common. Most family associations in Houston, I have to say, the Gees have been very progressive, and we've been complimented and I think rewarded for it, because they early on, the forefathers, if you will, the elders, allowed women to hold leadership positions. So Martha Wong is a Gee, by the way. She was our first female president, and in a lot of family associations, women never were given that opportunity or allowed to. Young people, so for young people to come back and assume leadership roles, that's not too common either. So I think we really do have a good, and that's why, our association is still pretty vibrant and everything. But that's a good example. And then just Asian or Chinese, I should say, holidays or traditions. They always are they like to learn about it and observe it. So I'm real glad that they do that. Mm-hmm. And so Lindsay in middle school, I should say, did her project on Angel Island, her history project. And that's really what got us all interested in Angel Island, because I knew my dad came through it, but I think, back when I was growing up, you didn't talk about it. It was a real social stigma. And actually it was more than that. It was like immigration today. You'd be afraid that you'd be picked up and sent back, deported, because it was illegal. And so in the 60s, when they, when all of the, when they started to repeal, well, it was repealed earlier, but it didn't really take effect until the civil rights legislation really pushed it. But we had an amnesty for those like my dad that had come over as a paper son. And so in 1961 is when that happened, and they allowed people like him, to go back and get their citizenship and to go and change your name back. So that's why our name is Gee, because I grew up from the time I was born till grade school, till I graduated from high school as Rogene Hom. Mm-hmm. And it worked out really well for me, because then I started college and going to Texas. It was still big back then. People didn't know me, so I went in as Rogene Gee. No big deal. But my high school and elementary, all the kids that knew me earlier, now I lucked out because my name Rogene is a little unusual, but they all, they knew me as Hom. But we went to court. We got a court order to restore our name, our name, to Gee. We kept Hom as our middle name, but after getting married, I let it go. And then he restored everything about him, his name and everything, but he didn't restore his age. So he was always 4 years younger. So he didn't get to start collecting on Social Security until he was 69. And so that was the only thing he didn't do. But yeah, so that amnesty period allowed us to, and so some families didn't change their names, mm-hmm. because again, it would be admitting that, you broke the law. But many did. And so that's why our name changed.
Did he keep in touch with his paper father? Or?
You know what? We never knew about the paper father, and he passed away. So Lindsay was born the year after he passed away. So when she did this project, it really, inspired us to learn more about it. That's when I talked to this Uncle Henry, who had moved to Tucson, Arizona by that time. But he was able to track my father's, family tree and how they were related and who was who, because we, you know how you call everyone uncle and aunt, you don't really know they are. Well, then he pointed out who really was part of the family line and who, wasn't. But we really never knew my father's family. So the aunt that introduced my mom and dad through her father, that was to us our closest relative, and they lived in San Francisco, so we always knew about them. And so their children, who are a lot older than me, there's a few of them are still alive, and so we try to stay close. But my father's nephews, one of them actually came from China about 15 years ago, or 12, 15 years ago. And he had, by that time my dad long passed away, but my mom tried to keep in touch with them. Mm-hmm. And so one time after she retired from the store, she and her sisters and brother-in-law took a trip to China. That's when, people were traveling more frequently. And they stopped in, they were able to visit with one of the nephews who I think met up with them somewhere in Hong Kong or somewhere. And that was the first time she had actually met anyone. And so, anyway, that was the only episode I remember of meeting one of my father's relatives, because his sisters had passed away, so the only people around were the nephews. And then this nephew moved to San Francisco, like I said, 12, 15 years ago, and they wrote a Christmas card and sent it to my mother's address. Well, at that time, my mom had dementia. She had dementia before she passed away. So my aunt was visiting, and my aunt from San Francisco, and so she could read the Chinese. And so we called the phone number, and she talked, and we talked, and that was kind of really neat to be able to connect. Mm-hmm. So we had a reunion in 2001. The year 2000, I think we had a reunion in San Francisco, and it was the first time in ever that our the Louis family, my mother's side, had a reunion, and we invited this nephew to come, because one of the traditions my mom always did is when she went back to San Francisco, she always had a dinner to invite everyone to come visit, because it's hard to go visit everyone. So right. That was a practice that we continued. So we were older, of course, and she was not in a frame of mind to be able to do this. So we had a dinner and invited all the friends and families, and they came, and that was the first time we met them. We had a second reunion last summer, a year ago this past summer, and invited them back, and so we've seen them. But we haven't kept a lot of close contact, just those two times. But they're in contact with mutual friends. But that's the only kin, besides, this family in San Francisco that my father knew. Yeah. And that's a shame. And I've been to China, to the cities, but I've never been back to the village. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to go, but I really need to go with someone who knows what they're doing and right. can communicate. And unfortunately, the Uncle Henry passed away 2 or 3 years ago. He has a younger brother who lives here in Houston, but and he's been back, and he probably would be great to take me, but he's actually getting up in age himself. So unfortunately, I didn't take the opportunity when I could have to go back. Yeah, I don't know if there's anybody left in the village anyway.
Do you know what your father's family did, their profession?
Yeah, no, I don't know. Be nice to kind of try to find that out.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a little about your personal life. So were your parents Christians when they came to the U.S., or did they practice?
So I think my mother was raised Catholic, because in Chinatown, in San Francisco, Chinatown, it was a big Catholic church there. Mm-hmm. So all the kids would go to Catholic school. But when she came to Houston, of course, the Chinese Baptist Church was the church that, and so that's something that's always intrigued me too. It's almost like which church kind of came and settled the Chinese, In New Orleans, when you go to New Orleans, the Presbyterian Church is the church among the Chinese community there. And in San Antonio, it's Baptist. So the First Baptist Church here is our church was a mission of First Baptist Church, and that's how it started. The history of the church would be certainly something good to put into the Chow Center. I don't know, maybe you have it, but somebody should document that, because our church was really the core of so much that happened. So when my mother first came, like I told you, she was one of the few Chinese women that spoke English. But Dr. Joyce Fan, who I hope comes up in some of the history, Dr. Fan was well educated, and she taught Sunday school and helped a lot of these Chinese women with a lot of, with their needs. And there's a photograph of the church group of my mom and several other women, and I was an infant, and she also had an infant the same age, Leland, who became a doctor. And it talked about how the church helped a lot of the women speak English and helped them get citizenship. So early on, the church did a lot of that. My dad and the men, they would work in the grocery store, so the store occupied their time, and they didn't take time off to go to church. And so growing up, if it weren't for the 3 girls that lived across the street from me, we probably wouldn't be going anywhere, because my parents were working in the grocery store, and my mom didn't learn to drive until we were like school age. She had to depend on my dad to take her everywhere, as a lot of women did. But she learned to drive, and then she was able to drive a lot of women around, like I said, to doctor's appointments and stuff. I'm sorry, I think I lost the question.
Well, that's all right. I was just asking if your parents came.
Oh, the religion.
Yeah.
So I have to say the Baptist Church, and
okay.
the Christian, yes, and Protestant and Baptist became the religion. But my parents really didn't attend church regularly. We children did off and on, because we had friends and people that picked us up, and that's what was done a lot, because of the families that ran grocery stores, like I said, couldn't take away their time or didn't close down the store. And so people would pick up their children and take them to church, or pick up their wives and children and take them to church.
Could you tell us a little more about the Baptist Church being kind of the center of the Chinese community?
Yeah, so I think back, so a lot of the church leaders, like I said, taught English, citizenship, helped a lot of the immigrants, with their lives and all. And then our generation growing up, it gave us a real great fabric for social activities, and gave us, wholesome things to do, and because we lived all over Houston, as we do now, I mean, there wasn't a dense southwest area. We lived all over Houston. So therefore we went to different schools, because back then you only had neighborhood schools. You didn't get bused to wherever you wanted to go. So we all attended different schools, so we wouldn't see each other in school. The church on Sundays or weekends was the only time we could get together socially.
How many people do you think attended this church?
Oh gosh, again, from the inception till when in its heyday, I would say, easily 500, we had the original church, and I probably am not thinking, because, it was before I was born, it started. So when I was growing up and can remember back, we had that church, and then they bought this property that they're on now and built this new church. By that time, I had gone away to college and all, so I wasn't as active. But it's kind of re-engineered itself a couple of times. Mm-hmm. But I would really recommend if somebody could do a history of the church, right, that would be great. Yeah. Because if now you see all kinds of religions here for Asians. And even back then, there was probably 2 main Chinese churches. the Chinese Baptist Church, and then there was another church, Grace Chapel, I think it was called, and I think they were an offshoot of the Baptist Church, but I think it was more non-denominational. Then, and I don't know when the Houston Chinese Church on Main Street started, but that was probably the next big movement, and that church is huge, and that's Christian, but I don't think it's any particular denomination.
I believe so. All right. Well, I want to be respectful of your time.
Well,
I know
I'm okay. I'm sorry. Just keep talking.
Oh no, that's all right.
If you have other questions, you can.
No, you covered so many things with your stories. Thank
more
you.
than you wanted to know.
No, that's wonderful. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share with us about your experience being part of the Houston Asian American community?
Well, it's just great to be able to share that, because I think now when we see so many, people coming to Houston and seeing it as it is now, to not even realize what it was before, and to be able to talk about that. And I'm 62, so of course I've seen it for the last 60 some odd years, but even before that, my family and people like that growing up here, and some of their experiences are different. So those that are even older than me, 10, 15 years older than me, I think they would speak a little differently about it. And then I know each person kind of creates kind of their own space. And when you ask me about being discriminated against, and when I say I don't remember any time when I was really overtly discriminated, just sort of made kid stuff being made fun of, but there are others that have felt it and can speak about it, and there are others that when they were growing up, they weren't allowed to go to school, and they had to go to another school or something because they didn't allow it. There are neighborhoods in Houston that didn't allow Chinese to buy homes in the neighborhood. And so, a lot of that did happen, and I don't want that to, be forgotten. And I just want future and present generations to realize that thanks to the, sacrifices on to a lot of the people before us, and some of our sister groups and ethnic minority groups, the African Americans and the Hispanics and all that have gone through a lot of it, we have also benefited. I really see Houston being a whole new place and the model for the country. I'm part of, by the way, Kleinberg's Connecting Communities. So I'm part of the social experiment, if you will. But I mean, even 10, 20 years ago, I have documents that show Steve Kleinberg was talking about this back then, that Houston was really going to be, was going to be a diverse community, and what were we going to do about it to make it the best community that we could, to all work and live together. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. With my experience this past year or so with redistricting, I've seen the demographic changes where before you would see a majority minority district like blacks or Hispanics. Hispanics now are demanding that they have districts because of their population growth. Unfortunately, I don't think Asians are ever going to get to the numbers we need to have our own districts, but we'll get close, and there may be pockets, but we're going to see more areas where there's not a majority of any one minority group, and we really are going to have to learn how to live, work, and govern together. So I think that's the message I will leave.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. We very much appreciate all your insight.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
All